I'm Joanne, Cary. Welcome back to Embodied Soul podcast, a multidimensional space intended to support you in living, being, and thriving as the embodied soul you are. Well, as you may hear in the background, the waves are crashing in on this beautiful full moon day, and I am inspired once again to pull out my phone and record an episode. And today, I'm feeling called as I look at the ocean and the waves as the tide is coming in, and there's a sort of a chaos to the waves. They're crashing in all different directions. The sand is being stirred up from the ground. And it brought to mind the chaos that we're seeing in the world right now that seems to be escalating. There seems to be a lot of circumstances that are pulling on our heartstrings, that are making people upset and angry and frustrated, and are really causing us a lot of disruption and suffering within the collective energetics, something that I feel quite strongly right now. So I want to talk about not knowing someone else's path. And this was a big one for me in terms of realization, because what I have found for myself and most people is that we are living our lives through a frame of reference or perspective that we have accumulated over time. It comes from our teachings, it comes from our culture, our religions, it comes from the experiences that we have. And because we're living our lives, we think that we know how everyone else should be living their lives, and that should be like the way we're living our lives. And so the challenge I've found with this is that leads us to a lot of comparison and a lot of judgment. For instance, if we're looking around at some of the things that are happening in the political structures that are happening to like wildlife and rainforest destruction and habitat loss and so forth, we can begin to say like, well, how can they do that? Don't they know that it's bad for them to be doing these things? Don't they know how much they're hurting people? They should stop doing that. And that is our perspective. And it's not necessarily the perspective that they're working on. And so if we rewind a bit, before we ever came into the body that we're in right now, your soul is sitting down going, okay, what are the lessons that I want to learn in this lifetime? What role am I going to play in this evolution and consciousness that's happening on the planet? What role is needed to be played that will benefit both me as a soul and the collective? Because everything we're doing here is a benefit to the all. So both personally, individually, we are benefiting as well as the whole. And so when we think that someone needs to be behaving a different way because we've projected our belief systems, our values onto somebody else, we are actually pulling ourselves down into a lower vibrational field. Because any judgment, any criticism, any blame, any anger at somebody else is all lower vibrational frequency. And so you can be sitting there living your life in a very high frequency, being love, spreading kindness. But if in the same breath you're also judging someone else for not living their life like you, for doing things that you would deem or label as bad, corrupt, or otherwise, you are pulling yourself into the same frequency of that you're judging, of that you're complaining about, of that you're angry with. Does that make sense? Because for you to see it and for you to start judging it, start complaining about it, start being angry about it, you are, in fact, going into alignment or coherence with the vibrational frequency of that exact thing that you do not want to see in the world. And so this can be a bit of a challenge for us. And this is where the more we embody our soul, the more we become spirit walking in body, the more we lift to a level of frequency in a higher octave that allows us to see from a more neutral perspective how all the pieces fit together, how every action has a reaction, how it's a dance, a partner dance, where we are dancing with the reflections outpictured. And then it comes down to, how are we choosing to respond to that we see outpictured around us that we may not prefer? And are we doing it from a level of consciousness that's creating the world that we want to see and the experiences that we want to have? Because remember, if you are in judgment, if you are complaining about, if you're angry and you are, or even if you are super sad, so there's the tragedy of all of those families and those girls at Camp Mystic in Texas who were killed in the flooding. We could be in mourning, in loss in our system for the loss of the children's lives, the lives not lived. And there's nothing wrong with feeling that emotion and putting ourselves into the perspective of the families that are what they're going through. And yet, if we keep ourselves in the state of suffering or blame of they should have done something differently, or this thing may have caused this to happen and this caused all these lives to be lost, we are causing suffering to ourselves. We are lowering our vibrational frequency, and that's not contributing to a solution. That is not contributing to holding people in a higher vibrational field. And this reminds me of compassionate action. I might do an episode on compassionate action. But on the whole, it is seeing those circumstances. So rather than going into, oh, that poor family, or what, it must be so devastating, I can't hardly imagine, I could never live if this happened. Instead of going into that, which is going into alignment with the sadness, the grief, and adding more of that into the collective, instead we can look and see and project onto them the highest outcome, how we see their hearts mending, how we see good coming from it, how we see over time the families, their hearts become whole again in the memory and celebration of the lives lived, how we see them moving on with their lives in the highest, and seeing the systems change to make it so that these things are less likely to happen in the future. Right? You see the difference in that. One is holding the lower vibrational frequency. One is directing and aligning to a higher level outcome that then supports everybody. And that's a beautiful role for a really empathic person, someone who really wants to support in a way, but doesn't have the place or the space or the money or the equipment to be able to make drastic exterior changes. But through your presence, through your focus, and through your intention, you can support any tragedy, any situation that you would label as unpreferred or disliked or bad or dark or otherwise. And again, we can reel this back in to your own personal experiences within your family structure. You can be using your own frame of reference and projecting it onto your partner, onto your children, thinking that they should be living their lives a certain way, when in fact they have their own lives and lessons to learn. And for us to pretend that we know better than somebody else what their life should look like, how they should be living, that's you trying to be God. That's you trying to be Source. That's you trying to know better than the soul itself that is having the experience. And remember that there's no one in your life right now, whether it's a family member or an acquaintance, there's no coincidence that you are meeting them in this multi-dimensional, infinitely potential experience we're in. All of this was potential, possibility. And so everyone you're coming into alignment with or in coherence with, having an experience with, there is a beautiful relationship, an exchange relationship happening. Think of it like the infinity loop. It's a giving and a receiving, a benefiting and a giving in order to have the experiences each soul needs in order to grow and develop and evolve as each one chose. And so with all of that said, as we begin to realize that we are not in charge of anyone else's experience, that it is our role to live our lives, to do the best that we can, to model the energetics, the behavior that we need, that we believe in order to provide that, possibility and energetics for someone else to tap into without trying to force, control, or manipulate them into being something that they're not wanting to be. Because you see the energy of that, right? You're trying to force your partner or your kids or your friends to do what you want to do. There's no difference in that vibrational frequency than when a government is trying to control who can do what women are able to do. And so we have to remember that we are these vast creator beings. We are creating our experiences, and it's all within the resonant field that we're holding. Like attracts like, for good or not so good, if you want to label it that way. So the more we take on our embodied soul self, the more we are able to actually see and respond from a perspective of a more neutral state, almost like being pulled out of your body a bit to be able to see the wider, broader perspective. And what comes to mind is an experience that happened when I moved down to Costa Rica, and it's looking at nature. And I think nature is an amazing reflection for us and a way that we can respond and be, and they're providing their own energetic codes into the collective field. But I love nature. I love spiders. I love butterflies. I love all sort of insects and birds and animals. And when I got down here, I would love to watch the golden orb weave spiders, and I would support them in keeping their webs, no one knocking them down. And I would be looking at caterpillars and watching them go through their cycle to butterflies. And each time I would look, I would have this spider, but then one day a bird would come down and eat the spider. And my initial response is, "Oh, you ate the spider. How dare you do that? Don't you know it's trying to live its life?" And then same thing with a caterpillar. Well, I'd be watching it get to a butterfly, but then I would notice that the wasps laid their eggs in it. And then so the caterpillar would not be able to make it to being a butterfly. And then I would be upset about that. And then I would see a hawk come down and take away the bird that maybe ate the spider. And then I'd have to reflect on, depending on the perspective that you're looking at, depending on whose story I'm viewing the reality through, there's a whole different perspective. So from the spider's perspective, it doesn't want to get eaten by the bird. It's trying to get a fly. And so it's not understanding the bird's perspective. Yet then when you look at the experience through the eyes of the bird, then you know that it needs to have the spider or the caterpillar in order to feed its young, for them to have their life experience. And then that's the same thing for the hawk who eats the bird. They need the bird or the small rodent in order to feed their babies and to live their lives. But when we notice that there's no intent for harm, there's no issue with what's happening. It's all agreed to on a fundamental layer of their consciousness to know that that's part of the experience that we're having down here. And where I got to it, because I ended up confusing myself. It's like, well, who am I supposed to be helping? Who am I supposed to be supporting? And I finally just said, it's not my role to determine what their experience is, and that I just decided to let nature. And I think this is applicable to what this topic is, because it's the same thing. We cannot, from our viewpoint, from the story that we are looking from, our lives, determine what anyone else's story or life is supposed to be about. And so if we are trying to control or narrate someone else's story, we're actually infringing upon their soul right, their free will to be able to have the experiences that they chose before they came down here. And it becomes more important for us to realize that each person has their own experiences. They have their own lessons that they're here to learn. And what we get to do is hold the highest vibrational frequency that we can in every now moment, so that we're contributing that energy, that high energy, to the collective consciousness. And by us radiating that higher level of frequency into the consciousness lifts, and that means every other soul now has the potential to choose a higher option. So it's their free will, but they're having an environment where they can actually see a higher choice, because we have been role modeling and being that higher frequency. Does that make sense? And so we're not trying to control what they do. We are living the highest expression, being that model of light and high frequency, so that it's easier for them to choose a higher path. And here's the thing right now. We are being called to fear. Through our media, through the circumstances, we are being called to shake hands with fear. And this is exactly what we get to do, is to not shake that hand, to see that we are being called to it, and then to make the choice over and over again to align ourselves to the highest frequency we can, so that we can make the high choices, so that we can be contributing a high frequency to the collective energies, supporting everyone else around us, and also supporting ourselves in having a reflection of the higher energies versus the lower energies. Because as soon as we shake fear, as soon as we shake the hands of fear, go into that dance with that, that's what we're getting back. That's what we're going to see, the same control, the manipulation, the same output that is not what we're looking for, which makes our choices so important right now. So for this week, just pay attention and reflect on, are you letting someone live their own life, or are you trying to control the experience they're having, thinking that you know better? Because we do not know the path that anyone is on, the experiences they're here for. And we don't know the story from their perspective. We don't know the life they came here to live. And the best that we get to do is to continue to choose over and over again the highest, to support them in making the highest choices they can. So is there anywhere in your life where you need to release that control, where you have been trying to live someone else's life for them? And is there anything you need to release, any pattern, any thought, any structure, any learning that says you need to do that? What is the pattern? What is the belief? What is the structure that is saying that I need to make them okay? I need to have them be in a certain way in order for what? To be accepted, to be successful, to have a better experience. Again, coming from our perspective, not necessarily from the perspective of their experience and their soul requirements. If you have enjoyed this episode of Embodied Soul Podcast, please like it, share it, turn on notifications, and subscribe to my channel. It really does help get the messages and energies out to those who need it. And I look forward to seeing you on next week's episode of Embodied Soul.